Welcome to the Podium Pod, the Pick and Roll's national basketball podcast as we begin the road to Paris 2024. I'm Adam Webster, and I'm joined today by Pick and Roll feature writer Jacob Dool. Jacob, welcome to the Podium Pod, and we've got a great game to talk about. Australia played Team USA and gave them a little bit of a scare in the second half.
They did, yeah. Thanks for having me on again, Adam. I think plenty to talk about from a game that sort of went back and forth, and in the end was a pretty close one, but didn't necessarily look like being that way for a lot of it.
It didn't. You're absolutely right. Let's start there. Let's start with that first half. Australia fell behind by double digits and as much as 20 in that first half and struggled to be able to contain the US from behind the arc. The US ended up 12 of 29 from three, but at one stage there, it seemed like they could miss from outside the arc. They were getting everything they wanted. Australia were hedging and doubling pretty consistently on offense, which was just leaving a free man. And against this USA team, there's so much talent that you can't necessarily afford to do that. So the defensive adjustment was made in the second half, right?
Yeah, it was. And I think there's always the caveat that you can't read too much into warm-up games. I think that goes doubly in warm-up games against Team USA, and I think that goes triply in warm-up games against a Team USA team that is one of the best, semblances of talent we've ever seen. So, there's going to be halves, quarters, games where they're just knocking down shots, and there's probably not a whole heap that most teams can do about that. But I think, as you said, what was promising was the way that they were able to make some little adjustments, both in game plan and in rotations, and at least slow down Team USA as much as they could and find some ways to disrupt what they were doing.
The second half play was much stronger, to your point. Australia were able to get within about 5 or 6 points there at one stage, and they were able to keep their USA were able to keep their distance, but Australia just kept sort of reeling the lead back in across that second half to the last term, where Australia gave it one good old crack, and then US, as the story of the game, made one final three, and that was the thing that obviously separated the teams at the end and made it impossible for Australia to come back. But I want to talk about Jock Langdale, because Jock Langdale missed the World Cup in Japan last year through injury, a late injury, which we were told at the time throughout the Australia Boomers squad was a big reason why they played the way they played, why they didn't make the noise that they expected to make. Jock Langdale was magnificent in this contest. He had 20 points, he had 7 rebounds, 6 assists, and just looked every bit the focal point of this offense. So it's really easy to see why the Boomers think that they're so much better with Jock Langdale on their team.
I think it's really easy with someone like Jock Landale after he misses the World Cup and then has an NBA season where he's injured at times, he's not getting as much court time as he would hope at other times. It's easy to forget just how good he is, particularly in this Boomers setting. And I think the game against the US was a really important reminder of just how good he can be, because he just did everything the Boomers needed him to do and more. Offensively, in the pick and roll with Josh Giddey, making the right reads on the move, as he rolled to the basket to pass or shoot or drive, and then defensively just mopping up around the basket and really crashing the glass. It really was everything that the Boomers missed at the World Cup last year. So I don't think you can expect him to be, a perfect fix to what went wrong in Okinawa, but I think his return is a bigger boost maybe than people might have even expected, because they looked like a whole different team last night.
Now, won't talk about Matisse Thybulle on this episode, despite everyone probably wanting us to do so. You wrote a great piece on pickandroll.com.au this week discussing Thybulle's omission from the Boomers squad. We'll talk about that a little bit more in long form on our longer form podcast, Unwrapped, so you can catch that on Friday. But I want to talk about the best lineup for the Boomers in the second half. I mean, for me, it was Jock Landale, it was Nick Kay, Josh Green, Dyson Daniels, and Josh Giddey in that second half that were making things happen defensively, and they were able to turn defense into offense more often than not in that second half. And they really stifled the US, which the Boomers really struggled to do for most of the game in Abu Dhabi overnight. The US scoring in the 90s in a FIBA game, 98 points, means that they had a really good offensive night. It could have been much more than that if the Australians didn't lock in on defense in that second half. And that was mostly due to that lineup, with also, I want to shout out Dante Exum and Will Magnay, who were really good subs So that was a good 7-man rotation that allowed the Australians to take the ascendancy and bring a bit of momentum back.
Yeah, you're right. Those lineups really did a good job of just messing things up for the US. As you say, you give up 98 points, maybe doesn't feel like that big a win defensively, but I think anytime you can force 18 turnovers against a really high quality team with a lot of good ball handlers out there and playmakers, I think that's a massive win and a positive to take out of the game. I think out of that 7-man rotation that you mentioned there was a couple that I found really interesting. Dyson Daniels, I thought, played very well, as you say, and we won't touch on Matisse Thybulle too much, but I think you sort of saw the things that
People all want
made
us to
Brian
talk about
Goorjian.
it, Jacob. They just want us to
Yeah.
talk about Matisse for the next hour.
The one thing I will say is that you can see why Dyson Daniels, if it was a 1-to-1 decision for the coaches, made it in, because he picked up Steph Curry full court on the first possession and didn't let him get anywhere. And from that point
Yeah.
on, he really was locked in defensively. And offensively, I thought he brought a lot to the table, as well as a cutter, knocked down the 1-3, finished well at the basket. So you can see a lot to like there. And the other one was Will Magnay, who I think some people were surprised to see him be the first big off the bench and play a lot more minutes than Duop Reith at the 5. But again, you can see why he's a lot more mobile defensively. So in those really switch heavy and blitzing on the screens in the defensive schemes, he's able to recover so well and cover so many gaps that it just makes a lot of sense for him to swap in for Landale and vice versa. So I think those two players really showed that they're not just going to be bit part players or end of the bench or anything like that. I think they have a really key role to play at the Olympics.
And we have to talk about Josh Giddey. I mean, you mentioned him before, but 17 points, 8 rebounds, 7 assists. He was the focal point of the offense. He was initiating, as we know that he can do, but it was a different level of urgency and consistency and a different level of speed of the pace of the game for Josh Giddey in this one compared to the 2 warm-up games against the Chinese in Melbourne last week. He really struggled in those games to really find his footing, but in this one, it was free flowing. He was 7 of 18 from the field, so he wasn't terribly efficient, but he was taking shots and he was aggressive and he was proactive, which is precisely what the Australian Boomers need Josh Giddey to do.
Yeah, and I think what was most promising was that he was able to get 2 feet in the paint so often. He doesn't have that really quick first step that a lot of guards need to get that penetration, but he just finds ways to get his defender out of position and still get that penetration and open up the floor by collapsing the defense. So you're right. I think it was really promising that there's things to tidy up. He needs to finish around the basket a little bit better, but I think just seeing Josh Giddey looking really confident with the ball in his hands and setting the tempo and setting the table is exciting. I think it'd be exciting for Chicago Bulls fans as well, watching that game, but in the here and now for Boomers fans to see him sort of looking like his old self again after a really tough NBA season, I think is a massive plus.
Now, I want to talk about Patty Mills in a second, but first I want to talk about Team Feet because the Podium Pod is brought to you by Team Feet. Team Feet offers premium athletic socks for modern teams, however they compete, with sweat wicking cotton, arch support, ventilation panels, and compression stitching. Team Feet socks are built to outperform. Whether your team is tiny or 1,000 strong, Team Feet unites and excites your players and supporters with their combination of quality and performance. Join basketball teams around Australia and the world by choosing Team Feet for designs and worldwide delivery. Head to teamfeet.com. Let's talk about Patty Mills because Patty started. He played 22 minutes. He was 2 of 8 from the field. He was a team low, minus 16 in the plus minus. Now, Greg Popovich will tell you that we can't look at a one-game plus minus for any sort of indication of value for a particular player because it's circumstantial and dependent on lineups. At the same time, we have not seen Patty find his shot so far, and we keep hearing analysts and people around the sport saying he'll find it, he'll find it, he'll find it. We're getting down to the last couple of games before Paris, and he's not yet necessarily looked all that comfortable, all that confident, which has to be a little bit of a concern because he's a guy that the Boomers have chosen to start, they've chosen to play, and if he's not able to add that value by shot making, then that has to cause alarm bells in the Boomers camp ahead of what's going to be an incredibly tough Olympics.
Yeah, it's getting worrying again, isn't it? We saw something kind of similar ahead of last year's World Cup where Paddy had some rough warm up games, and he had a good tournament in the end. He was
Yeah.
only just behind Josh Giddey as the leading scorer, but wasn't quite his usual efficient, really dynamic self still. And this has just kind of been a continuation of that to sort of the extreme. It just felt like he was playing tight last night. He was trying to force things a bit too much. So maybe he's obviously aware of the fact that he's struggling. I'm sure he must know that, but just felt like he was trying a little bit too hard to play himself out of it. Forcing a few shots, passes. He had 5 turnovers as well. So it's one of those things where the harder you try, the worse it gets sometimes. But I think the adjustment to having Josh Giddey running this team has been the roughest on Paddy out of everyone, because he's used to having the ball in his hands for the Boomers and just going to work. So maybe Brian Goorjian needs to look at splitting their minutes a bit more, and maybe that involves Paddy going to the bench. But there's certainly plenty to think about, because they do need him to be something closer to his best if they really want to compete.
Sound the air horn. Paddy going to the bench, Jacob. That's yeah, wow. That's
I know I'm not
not what I was
the first to
expecting.
put that one out there. There's the comment sections are ablaze after a couple of poor games, as they always are. But I'm sure
Yeah.
they'll turn on me if Paddy comes out and scores 30 in the next game.
Hot take alert. Yeah, that's if he comes out and scores 30 against Serbia tonight, then I'd
We'll
really
have to
like to
delete
see
the
the comment
tapes.
section. Absolutely. Let's also talk about another guy that didn't actually play, Duop Reith. Duop Reith had an incredibly good NBA season for the Portland Trail Blazers, which turned into a real contract ongoing for Duop. But only played 2 minutes in this contest, took 1 field goal, had 1 rebound. He was -9 in that 2 minutes, which is hard to do, to be fair. And I think, once again, circumstantial, difficult, because it's just a bad stretch. But is this just a case of Brian Goorjian saying, well, it's not working today, so we're going to take you out and start again next time? Or is this indicative of Brian Goorjian making a lineup decision that will transpire a little bit more regularly in Paris?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think Reith is just sort of an interesting case in this team generally, because he did, as you say, have a really good NBA season that followed on from this sort of quote unquote breakout World Cup campaign. And I think I remember it as, Jock Landale goes down, Duop Reith comes in and plays this massive role for the Boomers as their only center. He only played about 14 minutes a game, even then, in that scenario where they needed bigs desperately. So there's clearly
Yeah.
something there that is not quite trusted with Duop Reith. And I think it's probably defensively. He doesn't quite have the versatility. He's not quite as solid as a Landale or a Magnay. So maybe that's it. We know how much Brian Goorjian values defense. At the same time, I think he's definitely going to have a role to play in the Olympics, particularly in certain matchups where shooting at the 5 is more valuable. But I think a lot of people, maybe even myself included, saw a very clear pecking order of Landale and then Reith and then Magnay. It might be a little bit more give and take in those second and third spots in the rotation.
I want to call out the effort on the defensive end in this contest, because it was a different level to the China games. Now, they chased every loose ball around the court, which it struck me, and you and I spoke about it on the Podium Pod after the initial China games, that it seemed really stagnant and Australia couldn't really get anything going offensively. It's really clear that the more they play, their identity is that they need to get stuff going offensively by putting the pressure on the other team defensively, by turning defense into offense, by stifling the other team and using that momentum, that downhill momentum, to generate chances, because that's what they were able to do in this second half. And with, players like Josh Green and Dante Exum and Dyson Daniels on the team, and another guy I'll talk about in a second, you have the ability to disrupt. And that's always been an Australian identity, disrupt the momentum of the other team. It's just that we've had Paddy to make big shots on the other end. But defensively, it looks much more like your typical Boomers team.
Yeah, I think you're right. Traditionally, it feels like Boomers teams have been that sort of grit and grind on both ends of the floor. You junk it up and force mistakes defensively, and then you just grind it out at the offensive end. Whereas this new identity over the last couple of years that Brian Goorjian's trying to instill is You force those turnovers and mistakes, and then you just go. You run, you find easy baskets in transition. It's kind of where the Boomers came unstuck at last year's World Cup because teams slowed games down and took care of the ball, and the Boomers didn't have as much half-court production as they needed. But I think you can see the signs that they've further refined that defense. It was really promising last night, the way they were able to, against a really good team, sort of get it on their terms and force those mistakes. I think it will be interesting to see how the defense holds up against some of the European teams that play slower. But you're right, it was really promising to see the not only the execution but just the effort across the board and that sort of Aussie mentality coming back to the fore.
Got to shout out our lone commenter at this point, Jumbo Kevin, who said, quote, Will Magnay was a cone on defense, got humiliated by Ann in a crossover, blown by and posterized by Tatum, dunked on and stepped over by AD and gave up defensive rebounds. Look, Kev, I think you're being a little bit harsh, mate. I mean, ultimately, Magnay's out there as a rim runner, shot blocker. He blocked a few shots. He ran the rim. He's not known as a noted rebounder. So for the role that he has and for what he's doing, I understand what you're saying, but when he was left on an island with Anthony Edwards, I did feel for the man because there's very few places that I'd like to be less, Jacob, than on an island with Anthony Edwards in his current form.
I don't think there's too many big men in the world who would handle that scenario too well. But I will say what I really liked about Magnay was the stuff that doesn't show up on a highlight reel or in the box score. The Boomers were doubling on screen so much and really blitzing ball handlers. And what I liked was that Magnay was able to do that and get out and help on the screens and then recover back really quickly. So, where someone slower or less sort of switched on might leave someone open to go and double on that screen, I think the way that he was able to cover so much ground and disrupt the ball handler without giving up a passing lane around the basket, there was plenty to like there, I think. And so he had a couple of moments that he might want back, but I think the intent and the endeavor was there.
I think the other thing I want to call out is that previously the Boomers side, when it's fallen in a hole, when things haven't necessarily been going well, you always like to give another look. You always like to be able to change it up and to, try and make the other team's life a lot more difficult. And you want to talk about the ability for Brian Goorjian to throw a live grenade out there on the court. Matthew Dellavedova in 4 minutes made life as difficult for Team USA as anyone could possibly do. It was a throwback. You saw Delly guarding Curry as if it was the 2016 finals again. I love the fact that Delly is in this team and he deserves to be in this team, and he's showing why in very limited minutes. But if the Boomers fall in a hole in the group stage, they play Canada with SGA, they play Spain with their gluttony of guards as well, and then they play Greece, obviously, with Giannis. But if a guard catches fire, if a guy's really hurting you, then you could do worse than to just throw Delly out of the court for 2 or 3 minutes just to stifle and disrupt that one player.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about Delly in this role that's obviously going to be fairly limited, but he's not having to go full tilt for 30 35 minutes like he does in the NBL. He can play at 400% for 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Try to kill someone potentially. Just go absolutely crazy defending the ball. Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to put it. You're right, because he will just go absolutely flat out for as long as he is on the court, throw his body around, make things happen, and offensively make the right decisions. He's not going to light a team up himself, but he's not going to make any silly mistakes either, I don't think. So to be able to have sort of that steady hand at one end and a real X factor defensively at the other, it is kind of a nice option to have. And again, I can see why people might nitpick his selection. It's one that I questioned as well. But at the same time, I think you can see the trade-off and the value that the coaches see there.
Well, there's one final game in Abu Dhabi against Serbia as we record this in a few hours' time. We'll be back to you tomorrow night on the Podium Pod to have a chat about how that game goes. But I want to also highlight that FIBA has released the warm-up game schedule for the Boomers and the Opals for, in fact, the entire basketball world. And two games that haven't necessarily been talked about or publicized quite so much are the Boomers playing 2 final warm-up games in France, one against Puerto Rico and one against France themselves in France later this week, apparently on the 19th and 21st of July. So 19th of July against Puerto Rico, who won the qualifying tournament, and the 21st of July against the host nation, France. We haven't really heard too much about these games, Jacob, so it's good to see that the Boomers have a couple more chances to really hone that rotation and hone that identity. But the game against France is going to be tough. And for Puerto Rico, they're just plucky. They'll give it their all in every single game. And they're, not quite to the level of Australia, but the type of team that can get a scalp.
Yeah, and they're going at full tilt, aren't they? As you say, after the qualifying
team
tournament, they're already in do or die mode, mentally and physically. So they certainly won't give up an inch, and they've got enough talent there to really be a good test for Australia heading into the tournament. And then, as you say, France, we talk about how Will Magnay held up and how good Jock Landale was. Well, what a test that is against Victor Wembanyama and Rudy Gobert at the 5. So, yeah, a couple of really useful matchups, I think, heading into the tournament. And it's just good to know that there are, more than just these 2 really high-level games on the docket, because heading into the so-called group of death in Paris, I think the Boomers are going to need to be at 100% right from the get-go.
Absolutely, and we will be with you, obviously, every step of the way here on the Podium Pod. Jacob, I'll see you tomorrow night to talk about the Boomers and Serbia.
Will do. Really looking forward to doing it again.
We'll see you again next time. Thanks for tuning in.